we're doing. And,
Sure, the FBI knows.
Roger is gradually turning all these programs on their audio tapes for many, many years, and he's turning them into discs so that they will be available and reproducible in modern technology. And so all these programs from past years, really since 1980 was the first of these programs. So we have, we did count 150, many, at least 4 a year, and some years we even had 5 or 6. So that's also a wonderful resource, and now we are videotaping, so video, not taping. We're making DVDs of it. So the other distinguished guest who will tell you a lot about herself is Abigail Scott Duniway. Would you welcome Abigail?
It's so nice of all of you to come out on a beautiful day like this.
Abigail, you can turn your speaker on.
I did.
All right.
Can you hear me now?
We're good down here.
Okay. Good. Well, it is a bit warm up here. Now, half the women are dolls, the other half are drudges, and we're all fools. Now, I think that men and women should cooperate and can cooperate, just as labor and capital can cooperate. But in this society, we do not have democracy. We do not have a republic. We have an aristocracy of sex. In a society in which one half of the population rules over the other half, there is no democracy. There's a picture of me in my very late years. That is me with Governor Oswald West, who was supportive of women's voting, and I am there signing the proclamation for the Oregon Constitution giving Oregon's women the right to vote, and next year we'll be celebrating the centennial of that. So that's what I did. But of course I'm getting way ahead of myself. I was born in the state of Illinois. Are there any other Illinois natives here? I'm just curious to know that. No? I was born in Tazewell County, northern Illinois, in 1834. Illinois was settled from the bottom up, and my ancestors came from Kentucky, as many of the Illinois people did, including Dianne's family. Now, Illinois, in that period, was still very much a frontier. We felt we were pretty civilized because we had a frame house rather than a log house. That was a big step forward. And my mother had 12 children, 3 of whom died in infancy. We were pretty happy, and we were raising our corn and shipping it down the Illinois River to the Mississippi River. But my father had a very bad case of Oregon fever. You all know what Oregon fever is. And there were reports of this wonderful place near the Pacific Ocean. It had a great climate. It never rained there. There was a heavy dew that fell at night and made everything grow. And in fact, they said they had to nail down the coffin lids because sometimes the corpses would just get up and walk. It was such a healthy place to live. Now, my mother really didn't want to go, as I believe the majority of women, given the choice, would have preferred to stay where they are. It's really hard to know the answer to that. Anyway, we set out in the wagon train of 1852, which was the largest year for the westward movement. There had been gold strikes in southern Oregon and eastern Oregon. And the Oregon Donation Land Act had been passed a couple of years before. I mean, there was free land, and supposedly there's nobody living out there. There were some native people, but they didn't know how to farm. And all this good farmland was going to waste. so we thought. So we started out on the trip. And at first it was pretty exciting. We came through Missouri and saw slavery for the first time, which was very shocking. My family were staunch Republicans. Catches in my throat. Pro-Lincoln, anti-slavery. And that will be a theme of my life, the Republican Party, anti-slavery, and pro-African American. And I wish I had lived long enough to see an African American president. That would have been wonderful. At any rate, we take off, and it's kind of like going on a big camping trip. The kids are having fun. We get about as far as Wyoming, and my baby brother dies of plains cholera. He was 3 years old, and we go a little bit further, and then my mother died also of plains cholera. Do you know what plains cholera? No, I don't. It was cholera, and keep in mind that tens of thousands of people had made this trip. Oxen, mules, horses, people. The water was terribly polluted, and it was a very sick journey. And walking across, we saw grave after grave, and we piled them up with rocks, hoping the coyotes wouldn't dig them up. But it was very deadly. It took us from April until November of 1852 to reach the Willamette Valley. We stopped here, and we were out of provisions, so we bought provisions. They were overpriced, and I'm sorry to say the flour had weevils in it and the meat was rotten, but we did manage to keep going, and I got a new pair of shoes. And remember, most people actually walked across the country. There was all kinds of stuff packed in the wagon, so if you were able to walk, you were walking. When we got here, then we made the decision to go over Mount Hood rather than risk the rapids of the Columbia. And we arrived in the Willamette Valley on late November, actually. Then, because my father didn't have a wife and I didn't have a mother, we couldn't have a farm life. So my father took over an Oregon temperance hotel. This is called a cold water hotel. The interesting thing is it was temperance, no booze, right? But hard cider was okay. There were strange contradictions. At any rate, we did run this temperance hotel for many years. And when I was 18, then I married a young Illinois farmer, and we raised a large family, and they're in this next picture, I hope. So my mother had 12 children, and I had only 6, so I guess you could call that progress. Or maybe not. At any rate, you can see me in the long dress. My husband, Benjamin, whom I thought was terribly handsome, and it was very romantic for a little while. But as the babies came, we eventually had 5 sons and 1 daughter. The daughter is Clara in the back, and Clara died at age 30. And this was a terrible shock for me. It was the worst thing that happened besides the repeal of women's vote in Washington, but I'll talk about that later. You can see the baby there is maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3. So I have been spending my life on a hard scrabble farm, and women's lives were really tough, and men's lives were really hard too. Men did heavy physical labor, but women did the cooking, caretaking of children, the sewing. I made enough butter to grease the axles of the creation. And I made quilts too, and I must tell you about my quilt. I hope if there are any quilters here, please do not take offense. I didn't like any of this domestic household work. Any fool can make a quilt. After we had made a couple of dozen over 20 years, we quit the business with a conviction that nobody but a fool would spend so much time in cutting bits of dry goods into smaller pieces and sewing them back together. Just for the sake of making believe they were busy at practical work. And in later years, I made a quilt it was purple and black. And some of the women in the suffrage movement didn't think it was very pretty. They were gonna put it on display, but they didn't think that was a good idea. So they purchased this quilt. And this quilt, this was talked about by the quilter in Chautauqua here. This quilt was hidden away in Oregon History Center in a closet, and it's still there. So that's my feeling about domestic science and the labor involved with that. I'll just say a couple of things. My family turned out really well, most of them. One of the boys became the president of the University of Wyoming. One was a professor at Stanford, one was a lawyer, and one of them had a lumber business. So that was my family. But at this period, we have decided to leave the farm and move to Portland, partly because my husband had a bad accident with a wagon. Horses ran off and the wagon crippled him permanently, so he couldn't do any hard labor. And so how are we going to support ourselves? How can a woman make a living? Women can't run farms on their own. I did some school teaching, as you can see on the little program, but of course that didn't pay anything. Incidentally, I had less than 1 year of formal education. Can you imagine having a teacher who had that much education? And then I tried hat making for a while, because that was a period everyone wore big fancy hats. I even went down to San Francisco and bought materials and sold hats, and I got to meeting a lot of women and hearing their problems. And I decided to start a newspaper, and I think that's the next picture. My newspaper was called, oh sorry, this is a house at 5th and Clay in Portland where we lived in the 1870s. But notice I had a housekeeper and a Chinese cook by this time. And I was very welcoming to the Chinese immigrants because they could do the housework. And you'll remember, Chinese did laundry, they did cooking. They were not allowed to do jobs that competed with men. I mean, when they tried, they got in a lot of trouble. You probably know about the massacre over in Hell's Canyon, when they went gold mining on their own or otherwise competed with white labor, they got in a lot of trouble. At any rate, that was a house on Clay Street. It's no longer there. We lived in 3 or 4 other houses. None of them remain. And then the next one is a picture of my newspaper. The title of it was The New Northwest, and it was a family business, and you saw the boys. They did the typesetting. By the way, they call typesetters typos. Sort of cute, I think. They sold the paper, they collected the money. My husband, as I said, couldn't do physical labor, but he helped with the accounting. And of course, I was the CEO, I was the editor and the publisher, and pretty much decided what was going to be in the paper. This paper lasted for 16 years, started out as just a little 4-page broadsheet, and ended up as many as 8 pages. It had a circulation of up to 3,000 at various times. There were dozens of these newspapers, by the way. It's hard to believe that now we see newspapers disappearing. There's really just one major newspaper in Portland, but there were dozens of newspapers, because if you could just, get together a little bit of capital, you could set up your own press and run a newspaper. Now, this newspaper was in part, of course, a women's rights newspaper. But I want to read you what it said on the masthead, and I love this. A journal for the people, devoted to the interests of humanity, independent in politics and religion, alive to all live issues, and thoroughly radical in opposing and exposing the wrongs of the masses. This was not Fox News. And I have brought this book, which has selections from the newspaper, and it's really quite wonderful. In order to sell the newspaper, I traveled all over the Northwest. And in 1871, we had a visit from Susan B. Anthony. She came to Portland. She actually came to San Francisco and then came up on a steamship and met Abigail, met me in Portland. And the women who were running the national suffrage movement on the East Coast had a feeling that maybe the West Coast states could be brought in before all the East Coast states, and in fact that is what happened. By 1871 there were already 2 states which had given women the right to vote. 2 more would soon after, and then the Pacific states, Washington, Oregon, California, would come in before the National Amendment of 1920, the Constitutional Amendment. So when we traveled up here, we couldn't find a place to speak, and many places were closed to the suffrage speakers. As you can imagine, it was not a terribly popular issue. However, Abigail, I, and Susan spoke in the Congregational Church here. Do we have that picture? Oh, there's Susan. Susan B. Anthony. Bow down, everyone. That's the old Congregational Church, and you said that was down on the river.
Third Street.
Third Street.
Out crossing the Crime.
Oh, okay. And from reading this book, I wrote that Thomas Condon was a really pretty cool guy. He had discovered the fossil beds down there. He believed in evolution or some form of evolution. He was a geologist, the most famous geologist in the state of Oregon, and the town of Condon actually was named after him. But what I learned today, to my great dismay, he was not a supporter of women's rights. And even though he was a pastor of this church, there were women in the church who were pretty strong, I guess. They must have been on the board. And they said, Susan B. Anthony and Abigail Scott Duniway are going to speak here. So we spoke in the church, and we found the people of the Dalles to be very intelligent and very interested in the question of women's rights. After being here, we got on a railroad and portaged around the falls, where we got on a steamer called the Daisy Ainsworth. Went all the way up the river, and we eventually ended up in Walla Walla. Now, the people in Walla Walla, the official churches or halls wouldn't let us speak, so we had to speak behind a saloon. And this got us in a little bit of trouble. The saloon keeper brought us a drink and brought actually a glass of wine to Susan B. Anthony, who was, of course, a total teetotaler and Quaker lady. But she took the glass to be polite and just touched it to her lips. So the rumor went out, Susan B. Anthony is a drunkard, and they already suspected Abigail Scott Duniway of being a drunkard because she was not for prohibition. At any rate, that was one of the trips that I made, and I went to Jacksonville, and this was one of the more exciting ones. Do you remember that story? The newspaper editor down there was a Democrat, meaning a secessionist, a pro-Southerner, and he hated us and our newspaper. And when I got down there, I found myself hung in effigy. I didn't actually see the effigy, but people said it looked like George Washington in a dress. And it said on it, libeler of families. See, it was just felt that the suffragists were going to destroy the family. And that phrase goes on forever, doesn't it? So that was pretty exciting. Oh, and then I finally got up to speak in an open air in the park, and all of a sudden, pow, I got hit in the head with an egg. Can you imagine what would happen today? And however, it wasn't too bad because I hadn't shampooed my hair the night before, so, you know, I just kind of rinsed it out. It looked pretty good. Traveling around in Oregon in the Northwest in this period was a great challenge. And we traveled mostly by stagecoach. And because it rained so much, often there was just a muddy track. And imagine yourself going down through the Siskiyou Pass down there at Wolf Creek, just through mud, and it took forever. And there were many adventures. Once we got robbed, just like in a Western movie, And it was a man in a suit, and he came up and pulled a gun on us, and he demanded the strong box, and the strong box, it actually was under the seat. And so we gave it to him, and he took off, and he was never seen or heard from again. Another time I fell out of the stagecoach and landed on my head. Luckily, it didn't hurt me any. And then Susan and I went north to Canada. You have to be careful about Canada. Now, the Canadians, they have a queen, right? The empire has a queen, but, of course, they don't vote, which we thought was pretty ironic. And the road from Portland to Olympia to Seattle, thank you, and then across was pretty much a swamp. I mean, the entire west coast, you've read about Portland and Seattle, it was a swamp. The horses actually we just had to walk all the way. But we did travel up there and back. And then we went to the Oregon State Fair. This was a real adventure for Susan because she was an upper middle class, refined kind of person. And we had to sleep in a barn at the state fair. And of course it was pouring rain in droves. And she later said that this had been one of the most incredible experiences of her life. Now, I, of course, had walked across the country when I was a child, practically, so it wasn't that big a deal. But anyway, Susan and I tried to rally the troops and propagandize for women's rights. And the argument was basically twofold. One, it's the right thing to do. It's a moral thing to give women the right to vote. And after all, women were paying taxes. They were paying taxes. They were not allowed to own property. There was a terrible story. A man decided to take off, so he sold all the furniture in the house, left town, and I and some of my friends got some money together and bought her a house which she made into a boarding house. Well, the man decided to come back. And when he came back, he owned the boarding house because she couldn't sign a contract. So that's the sort of thing that did happen. It didn't happen all the time, but until there was a married woman's property law, which we did get before we got suffrage. These are the kinds of things that we were talking about. Okay, so the argument from moral standpoints, also the practical part, we just thought the society would be a lot better if women rose and could participate in everything, because women raised the men, right? And it would make it better for everyone. It was just that the men did not want to give up their privileges. So those are some of the travels. In addition to writing about the wrongs done to women and the need for suffrage, I also wrote about the treatment of the Chinese in Oregon. And this is not widely known, I think. Persecuted Celestials, we call them Celestials. And I wrote this, large crowds of ruffian boys amused themselves by pelting every Chinaman they could corner with snowballs, with hard snowballs. In many instances, the quality of material consisted more of wood and pebble, stones, and snow. Also, great stalwart men might be seen persecuting the Chinese men. And the Portland police, actually there was a militia, there wasn't a formal police department right then, but the militia stood by and watched this. Also, there was attempts to burn down Chinatown several different times, and the Chinese were made to put the fire out. In Tacoma, the Chinese were literally run out of town, the whole Chinese community, and then they woke up to discover there was no one to do the laundry. And I think this may be apocryphal, but it was said they put the laundry on train cars and sent it down to Portland, where many of the Chinese had fled, and then sent it back up there when it was clean. But you have to wonder at the level of the hatred of the Chinese. Now, I had a Chinese cook, I said, and he was a good cook. One day we turned on the faucet, and we did have a water supply then in Portland, and some snails came out of the water supply. I love this. I tried to get him to cook them, but he said, no, I won't cook the snails. If I'm forced to cook the snails, I will leave you. So we kind of let that go. One of my correspondents to the newspaper said that she had heard 10 major objections to women getting the right to vote. And I wanted to refute them. And maybe you can help me refute them. Okay, number one, these are the objections. Women don't want to vote. I hate to tell you this, but it was the case. You read the book, so you know. And Mrs. James Corbett, that's Senator James Corbett, of the town of Corbett, she was an anti, they called them antis. She would go around and follow the suffragists and get up and say, don't listen to them, we don't want the vote, we're happy the way things are. And, then their husband would buy them some new dresses and I don't know what. But upper class women who had servants, they were not always opposed. I mean, always for women's suffrage. It seems hard to believe. Anyway, women don't want to vote. Number two, women's sphere is in the home. I'm sure you've never heard anything like that. And three, she would neglect her home if she were allowed to vote. Here's my favorite. Men love women better when they're wholly dependent upon them than they would if the sex were self-sustaining. Men, do you?
I think that's nonsense and I'm lying.
Oh, and then back in the family, women's ballot would weaken the family tie and make trouble in the home. Number six, the political pool is too filthy for women to dabble in. And if you read about Portland, at the turn of the century, Portland was it was a poster city for municipal corruption. I mean, it was just deliciously corrupt. Votes were bought and sold. There was a ballot box in a saloon. And so you go in and vote. Oh, no secret ballots, because if you're going to pay somebody a bottle of whiskey, you want to make sure that they voted the right way. You could buy a Democratic senator for $5, it was said. Republican senator for $10. The Portland City Council was made up, half of it was made up of saloon keepers. The majority of the money that went into the budget came from liquor licenses. So you're kind of getting the feeling here that the liquor industry is a little bit nervous about all this women's rights stuff because a lot of them are prohibitionists, temperance people. But let's go on here. Oh, I love this one. 7. Bad women would vote. And men, what prostitutes would vote? I thought it'd just be terrible prostitutes would vote. And number 9, if they vote, they must fight in wars. I love these girls. And 10, they ought not to sit on juries. And this is interesting that, the juries that were held here in the courtroom that was held here, there were no women in this until well after 1912. And those first women who sat on the juries for the first time were ostracized and harassed. And think about it. Say you'd shot your husband. Well, that's kind of a long shot. In cases of domestic abuse, is what I'm trying to say. It was known that a woman would shoot her husband. This was not that rare, actually. So you get tried for murder before a jury of men. So the whole idea of jury trial by your peers is a radical idea, and it's a great thing that happened with women's vote. Okay, those are the 10. Now that I know you can think of many refutations, but women don't want to vote. Well, if they don't want to vote, they don't have to. There's no law that would force women to vote. Although apparently in Australia you are fined if you don't vote. And my students have a hard time with that. They didn't seem right, but
We get 98% turnout though.
yeah.
That's what-
Women's sphere is in the home. Well, let's just pass that one by. And she would neglect her home. That's the same kind of thing. Oh, men love women better when they're dependent. Well, I say, men love women because they can't help it. They loved them before the right to vote was even thought of. And there are no wholly dependent women, but courtesans. If men love such better than the self-supporting wives and mothers upon whom they depend to make home happy and rear their children, they are depraved. Oh, and then, okay, the family tie. Well, why would voting hurt the family tie? Men vote. Isn't that the same idea? I mean, this double standard thing runs through all of this, obviously. Bad women would vote. And I wrote, well, bad men vote. So why shouldn't bad women vote? Women suffragists, we believe in disenfranchising all bad people. I love that. But there's no reason to disfranchise the many good women just because there are a few bad ones. Women are frivolous and business affairs. We have not found women to be more unreliable, frivolous. And this one is quite wonderful. If women vote, they must fight in wars. And the point is, not all men fight in wars. Many are too small or have flat feet or whatever. And someday, when woman has been a voter long enough to understand herself, she'll teach men how to change their swords into sad irons and their guns into water pipes and settle their difficulties by arbitration. Woman produces men, and that's a bigger business for the country than killing them. That's very nice, isn't it? And we're still trying to reach that point. So these are some of the things that I wrote about. Also, my newspaper served as a kind of a Dear Abby column. And women would write, there's some new fancy shoes out. They have silver toes on them. Are those appropriate for, bourgeois women? And I said, no, only fast women would wear those kinds of shoes. And there was a question about bustle. We had to wear bustles. And a woman wrote, was it worth it to spend more for a steel bustle? Because a steel bustle in your skirt costs $2. And I wrote back and I said, don't waste your money. Just get a stack of Oregonians and roll them up and stick them in there and they'll be just fine as a bustle. And besides, that newspaper ought to be good for something. My brother, Harvey, with whom I planted a 10-acre cornfield as a child, was a brilliant and successful man. He was the first graduate of Pacific University. By the way, there was no question that I could go to university or my sisters. He was a city librarian of Portland. He was the founder of the Oregon Historical Society, and he was a part owner of the Oregonian, and he opposed women's suffrage. Wow. This has been described as a form of political sibling rivalry. But it was clear he was a part of the good old boy network, and on principle, he had nothing against women voting, but he wanted to be friends with the ruling group in Portland, the saloon keepers, and all the rest. And Harvey died a millionaire, and there's a big statue of him. I think it's in granite. I've never bothered to go and look at it. But he died a millionaire. Like the smart pioneers, he bought land in Metro. Metro, you know what I'm talking about? And did very well. I, on the other hand, died not in poverty, but I never got to travel abroad. I lived a very frugal life, and then I took care of my husband until he died. What's the next picture? Okay, that's the church, Thomas Condon, remember, anti-woman. That's very late in life. I hate that picture. But you'll notice this blouse is velvet and satin and course, the hair, the Marcel hair, showed I was very much into wanting acceptance into the upper class, even though my views were not that popular. And then the next one, I think, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. Oh my goodness, it looks like my lavalier. This lavalier belonged to my great-grandmother, and I brought it across the Oregon Trail. And when we left the Midwest, we said goodbye to our families for good. Most of the pioneers never went back to visit their families and the graves of their ancestors. And this is a nice reminder of my grandmother. But you can see there I'm dressed very sensibly and severely, and of course with the big hat. And that's 1914. And then the next one shows me casting my vote. That was actually 2 years after. It's interesting that during this period, the early 20th century, Oregon passed the initiative and referendum laws, also direct election of U.S. senators. Senators used to be elected by legislature, so that was a big reform. All these reforms are going on, and yet nobody's saying, how can we do all these democratic things and leave out half the population voting? It's hard to understand, really. But I think that's a wonderful photograph. So, do you have any comments or questions at this point?
Why did she oppose prohibition?
Okay, thank you for asking that. She believed that prohibition wouldn't work, number one, and that it should be a matter of personal choice whether you drink or not. And she said this publicly: if I want to have a glass of wine, it's not the government's business to tell me whether I can or not. Now, she didn't drink, and she was very proud and said that her sons didn't drink. Of course, she doesn't want to know that. But there's a big difference between temperance and prohibition. And that's the reason the saloon keepers were more favorable to Abigail than to the temperance leaders was that she did have this more individualistic, liberal view of the law. And of course, she was absolutely right. As you know, prohibition was possibly the worst law that was ever passed. It was unenforceable, and it gave rise to organized crime and all kinds of bad things. And people kept drinking because as long as you're growing fruit and wheat and all those things, you can make alcohol. But this got her in a lot of trouble with the leadership of the national movement, which was by this time very, very prohibition oriented. The temperance.
Well, related to that, then, so Oregon adopts it in 19. When was the Volstead Act?
1919.
I mean, 19. Okay, when was repeal or whatever the word is?
33. Theodore Roosevelt. 1933. Some of you were alive then. And it's very interesting. They showed pictures of Franklin Roosevelt with a martini. Have you seen those pictures? It's like all of a sudden, hey, it's okay. Because the government said, we're really in bad trouble. The thing to do is to legalize this stuff and tax the heck out of it. So that's when it was repealed. And it was really difficult. Repealing a law, you have to go to each state and have it voted on. But we did have prohibition from 1919 to 33. And a lot of people don't know Oregon had state prohibition too. As I say, it did actually cut down somewhat on the amount of drinking, but not very much.
A quick comment on that. Oregon vote, I believe it was 1914, which was the state went right over, somewhat ahead of the nation.
That's correct.
And August Butcher, who owned the brewery here at the foot of Brewery Grade, the decision was going to take place on the 1st of May, and his famous quote is, "The 1st of May will be the last of August."
August. Oh, yeah.
And everybody else.
Abigail felt that the way to stop people from drinking too much, and people drank a lot. Remember, there's not the whole sort of cafeteria of drugs. It's just alcohol. And men got drunk, they spent up the family money, they beat up their wives. It was a terrible problem. And the women in the temperance movement felt like if they could stop alcohol, then they wouldn't have to worry about voting. It seems a roundabout way of looking at it. And it was only when the temperance leaders realized the only way they could stop booze was by getting the vote, then they joined with the suffragists. But temperance is a very interesting part of our history. As I say, alcohol is everywhere. And rum, back in the very early period, the rum trade, there were people like Abraham Lincoln was for temperance, a lot of prominent people. And the temperance movement started among Protestant ministers, male ministers, obviously, there were no women ministers. And that's before the Civil War. And as more immigrants came, especially from Ireland and Germany, which was sort of more identified with heavy drinking, became a nativist, sort of anti-immigrant movement. After the Civil War, then the women took over the temperance movement. You've heard about the women praying at the saloons. This started in Ohio. Dozens of women would go and pray and sing in front of the saloons. And Abigail said, well, prayer's fine, but, keep your powder dry. They even did this in Portland. They went to the Webfoot Saloon. I love it. And they prayed and sang, and this really makes the saloon keepers mad. So they would hire young boys to go out and harass them. They actually arrested some women. They were going to put them in jail, but decided not to jail them. Anyway, it has been said by some of the national leaders of the suffrage movement that the temperance idea held up women's voting by a whole generation or even more. And you can see what happened. In the state of Washington, the legislature passed suffrage for women, 1883. Women went out and voted, and they started voting some anti-liquor laws. And the men got together and, well, we don't really like this. So they repealed it in 1887.
How did they justify that? Under what?
They said, well, they were always justified. They said, well, it looks bad for, we're going to wait until the entire nation goes for women's suffrage. We don't want to stand out in this crowd.
It's kind of like you can't stand a drippy faucet, so tell them in the back, you don't have to hear it.
Anyway, it's looking back on the temperance movement. You know about Carrie Nation. I've gone around in my Victorian clothes, and people say, "Oh, you look just like Carrie Nation with her battle axe breaking down the saloon windows." That was a part of the movement. There wasn't very much violence, but Abigail Scott Duniway was very tough and strong and said, "This is not the solution." They got her in a lot of trouble. So.
So, another direction.
Yeah.
Amanda, she had one, when I first skimmed through this, and I kind of did a little brief reading on her before I came, it just stuns me that she came, her life must have been really hard. How did she get to have those big houses? What was that, was she economically successful? Was that newspaper?
You say, but that was a sort of a modest house for that time period, I think.
But having have 6 children and be able to go and do all this traveling.
Well,
and
you can go out and borrow money. She went out and borrowed money for the press, and also her brother, it was an interesting relationship. He did give her money from time to time because he felt guilty. And she was friends with all the important people. Holiday Park in Portland, he gave her train passes to travel with. And the women were giving her money to support her.
Okay.
But in answer to your question, so it's interesting. Oh, let me just say her views on religion. She had a big problem with the churches, but she did believe in a higher being. She said she believed in Christianity, but not what she called churchianity. That is, people who go to church who are not. And she leaned toward the Unitarians. They were her favorites, but she never joined them. She said, oh, it just seemed kind of silly to join the Unitarians. But her good friend was David Elliott Lamb, who was a Unitarian minister in Portland and founder of Reed College. And she did like the Unitarians. I mentioned a little bit of her politics. She was very anti-monopoly, to the Jeffersonian ideal that everyone should have a small business or a small farm and there should be cooperation rather than competition. She was against the gold standard. You remember, mankind shall not be crucified on a cross of gold, because that was identified with the banks and the wealthy classes. Her views on sex, do you want to know her views on sex?
Yeah.
It was not spoken of very often, and contraception was not mentioned. The only people who would use contraception were prostitutes. So she felt that abstinence was the best policy, but that it was okay to participate in a sexual act once a month. This was not popular with the men. And she was very uneasy on this whole subject, and gay people, that didn't exist. She didn't talk about that. Oh, also her religion, she was a spiritualist, meaning that after her daughter died, she was totally devastated, so she held a seance and brought in a medium. And she really felt that she had communicated with her daughter.
What did her daughter die of?
Tuberculosis. She lived at Lake Camas, or do they call that Lacamas or something over there in Lacamas, over there in Washington. And that was interesting. Also, the man whose name is Uren, who was responsible for the initiative and the referendum and those progressive reform, he was a spiritualist. Many people believed in it. And what happened, there were a lot of really crooked mediums, and they were setting up phony things, and then the whole movement sort of died away. But Abigail's very much a child of her time, and I do have to say her views on Indians was terrible. And when she was in Pendleton, she said, Pendleton swarms with Indians. They're big, lazy louts. They sit around, and their women do all the work. And now there's some people who think that they can be civilized. If we put them in Indian schools and cut their hair and make them Christians and, what's the other thing, make them wear Western clothes, maybe they can be civilized, but she was not sure about that. It was a problem. She dealt with it all her life. She knew that there had been some really awful things happen to the native people, but the pioneers were not good on this issue. I mean, you don't come and take away people's land and kill them and bring them all these diseases and then say, oh, don't they have a wonderful culture? So she was very much a part of her times in that, and those are ideas, again, that carry on down to the present, unfortunately. I think it's interesting to ask a question: how has women's voting changed our society? It's a tough one, isn't it?
My grade school teacher said that we had the three worst presidents the country ever elected immediately after women got to vote. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover.
That's a good, yeah, that's good. That's
Well,
cool.
I surmise that certain people were kept out of office that would have been in if it weren't for that.
Well, it's also interesting to compare Washington and Oregon. Oregon, with all this political voting activity, has a male governor, 2 male senators. The entire congressional legislation is white and male, except for David Wu. If you go to Washington, you see just the opposite. The governor, our 2 senators, I'm from Washington, are women. And at one point, the Washington legislature had 40% female in it, a very high proportion.
One time they had all the Supreme Court judges were female.
Really? I didn't know that. Oh, I just want to say something about the franchise. The extension of the franchise has been a sort of a way of looking at the progress of democracy, if you will. Who could vote at the time of the American Revolution? What kind of land?
Male.
Right. And what does the Constitution say about voting? There's this trick question. The Constitution does not contain the word woman, female, or sex, or slave for that matter. And some of the women on the East Coast said, we don't need this suffrage movement because we can vote right now. Right? There was no law prohibiting it, not even locally. So Susan B. Anthony went and voted. You probably know this story. You know what happened? She was arrested for voting. Not for voting, but for disturbing the peace. And Abigail and some of her friends went and voted in Portland, and so they gave their ballots to the clerk, and he put them under the ballot box. And you couldn't file a lawsuit, unfortunately, at that time. So it was just sort of custom. And that's why it's really important that the suffragists, especially women like Abigail, who wrote and spoke and fought for these changes, to do all this. And it's kind of sad that so many people do not take advantage of the right to vote. Oh, I was going through. Okay, so when did we have universal manhood suffrage? Does anybody know that? And all men, well, all white men.
Native people weren't allowed until 1923.
Exactly. White males could vote in 1840s. And it's interesting, that's about the time that the women got together and organized the women's rights movement in Seneca Falls. Because there was they were not going to extend it to women. Okay, so all the men could vote. Then what happens after the Civil War with the freedmen? The African American slaves. That's right. The 15th Amendment gave the vote to the former male slaves. Again, there was no question of letting the female slaves vote. Now, in fact, did they get to vote? No, because that was one of our early terrorist groups, the Ku Klux Klan. African Americans didn't vote until the 60s.
Indians.
Native Americans, as she said, was 1923. And then it was in the 70s, I believe, when it became, the voting age was lowered to 18. Right, so who doesn't vote now?
Everybody.
That's the people there.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of ironic because one of the original signers of the Oregon Constitution in 1847 or something, his name was Nicholas Shrum. He was a half-breed Cherokee Indian, and him and his buddies were all Democrats, and when they were taking a vote for the Civil War, they went and hid out in Shrum's barn so they couldn't take a vote. So what they ended up doing was making a law that you couldn't bring blacks into Oregon, so therefore they could stay out of it.
Right. Oregon Territory had a law excluding black people. I'm sure many of you knew that. Oregon was the only state that came into the Union in 1859, the year this building was built, and Wasco County became a county. It was the only state to come into the Union with an exclusion clause. Pretty amazing. And that wasn't repealed until, Gene, do you know? Really late. And Washington, for some reason, didn't do this. There was a whole African-American town in Centralia, some may know about it. It was run by a really sharp guy called George Washington Bush, believe it or not. And it was a thriving black city. Now, what happened? Did blacks actually come into Oregon? The justification for this, there's always a bad justification, was we don't want to get involved in the Civil War. We want to stay out of that. So the way to stay out of that is not to have any slavery, and well, we might as well not have any blacks here either. So it was not welcoming to blacks, and of course Oregon has a small black population. Abigail was friends with the black community, and she spoke at their Emancipation Day dinner on January 1st every year. So she was quite liberal on that question.
So she had awareness of class and race, black race. But feminism was her driving force.
Well, that's certainly what she's known for. I mean, I personally am really drawn to her exposing the corruption in the city and speaking out for blacks and Chinese people. And unfortunately, she was just terrible on the Indian question. The only other thing I wanted to say was that I've done this presentation 2 or 3 dozen times probably, and often sometimes there are relatives of the Scotts and Dunaways. Remember, they all have these big families, and Harvey Scott, many of the Scotts are buried over in Forest Grove. So I'm giving this talk, I'm getting ready to give this talk, and a woman came up to me and she said, "I'm Abigail's great-granddaughter." And it was really something, and I said, she looked like Abigail. And I said, "I wish you told me this after." but she was happy. She pointed out, which I don't think I did, it was Benjamin Duniway who suggested that she go after the vote, that this is the only way you can remedy many of the problems that women are having. So that was interesting. And then also Harvey Scott, I'm not real fond of him, as you can probably tell. A great niece and a really old woman, must have been a great niece, and then her daughter came, and they came after the talk, and I said, "Oh, I hope you didn't think I was too hard on Harvey Scott." And they said, "Oh no, we agree completely, he was just awful." So women vote, yes, sir.
I was just intrigued by the expression on the person's face in the picture behind her there.
Yeah, the guy. I noticed that too, I have no idea who it is. Which one?
And the other thing is that I think the year that she came across is the same year or the same time period that my ancestors came across. And my great whatever it is grandfather was Joab Powell, and he was a Methodist circuit rider and came across with, most of his 12 kids at the same time. And the books written about him talk about him, having services practically every night there, when they camped at night. So it'd be interesting, to know whether their paths crossed somewhere along the way. So.
Well, that was a big argument on the Oregon Trail, because so many of the people were religious, whether they should continue to go on the trail on Sunday, or whether they should have a day of rest and worship. And that was a big argument, because like you said, she didn't get here till November. And some of the people got later still, so sometimes they started the trip having services on Sunday, and then realized they weren't making the progress they needed to. And then there was a division, and some of the people would stay back. And the other story I heard about her on the trail was that they had hidden money underneath a wooden board in their wagon, some gold, so that they'd have something to start with when they got here. And somehow or another it was lost on the trail. Whether it was stolen or whether it fell out or what, but then they got there and here was their seed money, which probably wasn't a lot of money anyway, but that was lost. So not only did she lose her brother and her mother, they lost this money and they still ended up here trying to. I agree, I wouldn't have come.
Another thing that's interesting in this opposition to suffrage, as I say, it was really financed by the liquor industry. And the city of Portland and the Oregonian were opposed to it. But the small town newspapers were almost wholly behind women's voting. So that's interesting, because Portland, they consider themselves so green and liberal and progressive. And yet if you look at them historically, that has not always been the case. They don't like to talk about this.
Yeah, it's because when you get a bunch of men together, they become an entity. But the guys who live like on ranches, they realize how important a woman was, because she did so much to support the men. That's my opinion.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting about Abigail is that, remember, she was about 40 years old when she started, and she voted 40 years later. Compare that to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were dead before they got the right to vote. So she's the only one of the major figures. She was a vice president of the National Women's Suffrage Association who saw the movement through to its end. So now,
Wasn't there a big division in the women's movement with the idea of black male suffrage?
Yes.
I mean, that was a huge split in terms of we're better served to help these guys get it, and then it will be next. I mean, wasn't that sort of the story they were given?
Right. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton both opposed giving the freed slaves the right to vote. This has been really damaging for a lot of reasons. There was another group, Lucy Stone and Blackwell, and they said, no, this is the Negroes' hour. We have to support them and keep working on our own. So then there became two suffrage movements, a national movement, national women's suffrage movement, and American women's suffrage movement. And Abigail, out here in Portland, was responsible for bringing the two wings back together. Although I have to tell you, she sided with Anthony. Well, she was a friend of Susan B. Anthony and Stanton, so she really didn't. Well, you weren't there, so you don't know how you. It was really hard for women to see the freedmen get the vote and then be left out again. So, any other comments? Well, thank you. Thank you.
I can kind of pin it out of that because I worked on this ranch 16 years and 10 months, and the first 8 years and 4 months, single women couldn't talk to each other. When the boss made it permissible, even then some of the supervisors under him didn't approve of it.
Well, so do you think there's total equality? This is a stupid question. Is there total equality between the sexes today?
No.
What do you think, Carl?
No, not quite.
And this gentleman back here also pointed out, I have spoken to audiences where men have said they still think it was wrong that women were given the right. I mean, they're pretty brave to say that. And then you look at all the problems in society. I mean, hey, girls, we're responsible too. What can we say? Have we used the vote wisely? I don't think so.
But the reason you give women the vote is the same as the reason that women don't necessarily vote one way or another. That is, women are all individual people.
That's right.
And the men were afraid if the women came in, they'd vote as a block against whatever it was they didn't want, temperance or whatever it was. But today, women don't vote together. They didn't vote
That's
together
true.
right after they got the vote.
That's true.
And I think that's a reason to give them the vote, actually, as opposed to us always voting for the same issues. We're on the opposite sides of things like right to life, which, should be a women's issue.
Well, I think in most things, as I follow this, women tend to be a little bit more liberal. Do you agree with that? Not a whole lot, no.
Well, voting polls show them, women vote far more liberally than men do. I'm accused all the time, oh, you vote like a woman.
Over in Europe, during World War II, the Nazis publicized who they voted for, while those that were pro-freedom kept themselves who they voted for.
Do you have any knowledge of, like, where was the movement in the United States with regard to the rest of the world? Because, even now,
That's a very good
suffering.
point. Because, we kind of think we kind of lead the way in a lot of things. There were 7 or 8 countries that already had women's suffrage, and one of them was Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution gave women the right to vote in Russia in 1917. So we were kind of behind on that.
When you say kind of, that's all within the same, decades or 20.
Right.
So edge for women's suffrage in world history, really. Isn't that not the case?
Which was the leading edge?
United States.
At the turn of the century, this movement was going on. Turn of the 19th and the 20th century.
Well, yeah, but
because even now, in the world, there's a lot of areas where women do not.
one of the really important factors was the First World War. And women didn't go and fight, but women really were supportive of World War I here and in Europe and in other places, and that was one of the reasons that the politicians felt that they. So there are a lot of things going on. The industrial countries are being urbanized, and there's better communication. So there are a lot of things that kind of come together. But you're right, it's not a big difference.
We talked about, she could not own property. said he could not own property or has we have. Southern states, some of them still have that.
Is that right?
I own property in Kentucky. I cannot rent, buy,
We live in this world of technological wonders and technological difficulties. Couple things before we start. Let me pass the socks around once again. We encourage and welcome donations. If you'd like to make a $15 donation, you can do that downstairs and you become a member. And that means you get newsletters and information from us about other programs going on. We have a couple distinguished guests here, and one has asked for a word. And Warren 80 is a military historian.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Just want to be real brief. There's a new armory being constructed in the Dalles by the Oregon National Guard, and I've been tasked with coming up recommending names for this new armory. And so if any of you are interested in participating in that process, let me know and I'll give you my card so you can contact me, and I'll contact the various historical societies too. Basically, the criteria are is it should be somebody who has an Oregon military background, made a contribution to the community, region, or state, is deceased, has not been significantly honored otherwise, but maybe has been decorated or otherwise recognized. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a person, it could be an object or geographical feature we can use. So, if you, like I say, if you want to participate in this process, just let me know and I'll give you a card. The Adjutant General of the State of Oregon is the one who will make the final decision. We just make recommendations to them.
Okay, and another distinguished guest here is Lauren Irving. Lauren is with the Oregon Historic Trails Advisory Council. They mark the trails and preserve the trails and preserve that history. And we're going to get him back here one of these years to do a program on Fremont. Some of you saw it out at Discovery Center, but he does a wonderful program tracing Fremont's travels through this country. Well, a lot of things happened right here at the Dalles in years gone by, and in the earliest days of white settlement, this of course was a military fort. You do have to imagine a time when there weren't all the roads and all the connections that you see now. When the Oregon Trail was really a number of sets of ruts across the hills and valleys leading to this place. And then imagine what it would be like to move a whole army through that kind of land. And of course the military presence here was very important in mapping the land and getting preserving the safety of the settlers, all kinds of things that were accomplished in those early years. Well, we have to thank Sandy Bissett for running into Malin Kriebel out at Discovery Center when he was doing some research there several months ago. And he has done this little booklet on the Steptoe campaign, which was the prelude to the Colonel Wright campaign. And Steptoe's campaign turned into somewhat of a disaster. And Malin's studies of those original field drawings and maps really tell a different story than the one that has been passed down, and that's a very interesting read. But he has studied these maps, which were done by the topographer who went along on the Colonel Wright campaign, and he's going to tell us all about that. And should we figure out now or wait till afterwards? He is willing to do some field trips out here in Wasco County and Sherman County, tracing the route. He'll be willing to do that tomorrow, but we haven't picked a time.
We can talk about it afterwards.
Do it afterwards?
Because
Okay.
I'm hoping there'll be some questions.
Oh, there will be definitely questions. Okay, those who are interested in that trip, some of you did sign up and were demonstrated your interest in it, but we didn't give you a time. You'll have to come up and figure that out among yourselves at the end of the program. Malin, it's all yours, and I think things are working now. You're on.
Is this mic working?
Yes.
It's quite by chance that I became an amateur historian. The family farm that I retired to is not far from the Lapway Trail, which is the Nez Perce Trail from Lewiston to Spokane or Coeur d'Alene. And so I got interested in Indian trails. And in doing that, I went to Catawba and visited with Father Connolly, who didn't know anything about trails, but his interest was in Selah and early Coeur d'Alene history. Selah was a camas ground for the Coeur d'Alene Indians. They'd been hunting for it for years. They didn't know where it was. He wanted to find it, and I said, okay, I'll keep my mind open and ears open. And I indeed stumbled across it from the Mullen papers, and those were published in the 35th Congressional Record, as many of you know. So I wanted to look at the original Mullen record. A trip to Washington, D.C., to the archives. I knew the call number. Several people had given me that information. But I was unprepared when they brought out 6 cartons of material. And the Mullen field notes were just a couple field note booklets in this huge array of material they brought out. And so I thought I would thumb through and see what I would find. And one of them happened to be the field notes made by Colecki. And I show this one here. And these little booklets are 3.5 inches by 7 inches. And Colecki was a master draftsman. Colecki was with Wright on the Wright campaign, who followed 4 months after the Steptoe campaign. So we're really going to go through 2 battles. The Steptoe battle, which is called Battle of Tohogonimi, that occurred a little bit north of modern-day Rosalia, and then spend time on the Wright campaign, which was a lot larger and had far more impact. Although the Steptoe campaign, which led into the Wright campaign, had enormous impact on the outcome, as it turns out, of the Wright campaign. Well, anyway, it was quite by chance that I stumbled across this Colecki field note map. I have a field note booklet, which has about 150 maps in it. And the way they would do it at the time, on the right hand, when you open up the book, on the right hand page was a map, and the left hand was the bearings and locations of all of the points that he used to make and construct the map. And to give an idea, because this area here is of local interest since we're here in the Dalles, these are the pages I pasted together to get from the Dalles, and this map here is starting at Biggs, and to get to the Umatilla at modern-day Pendleton. So each one of these is about 7 miles, and I invite all of you to come up and take a look at these because they give an idea of how careful this topographer was, Colecki. Now the entire Wright campaign was 760 miles round trip, and so we're doing about 40 or 50 miles. How far is it from here to Pendleton?
120.
Okay, so this is 120 miles, about 1/7 of his entire campaign, as it were. Thanks, Lauren. Just gather this up. The original copies I made were with an overhead Xerox, which was not very good, but I was very excited about it because it indeed changes how we view, particularly the Steptoe campaign. Last summer, Moni and I went back to Washington, D.C. with a digital camera. These are digital records, and the ones I'm showing you are from digital images. And the reason they'll appear clear is that I went through several programs that the camera came with, and the pages are very brown today, and Kalecki wrote so small that you couldn't read, or I couldn't read, the original documents. But by getting rid of the brown background, blowing up the images, and doing several color corrections, which I don't know what they did, but they made a better image, I was able to read them. Finally, it's quite a tribute to this guy, Kalecki. He wrote so clearly. He used a very sharp pencil, he put a lot of information on each page. And with a magnifying glass, you can make out what he had to say. The problem I had is that he was German, and he mixed German Proctor with English printing. And so I had to learn his alphabet. And I'm still in the process of doing it. Okay, so we're going to do 2 battles and look at the campaign routes of both battles. Oh, I'm going to have to learn how to point this. Now, I've reproduced this map over here of Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. And the Steptoe battle starts at Walla Walla, or campaign starts at Walla Walla, goes over to modern-day Moscow, up to the little village of Farmington, over to Rosalia, and back. So the red is indicated here is the Steptoe campaign. And on a regular road map, this is the Steptoe campaign route, up to Rosalia and back. In comparison, the Wright campaign starts at the Dalles, or one could say really Fort Vancouver, which is a little further down. But the actual place of assembling the troops was here at Fort Dalles, and then they marched to Pendleton, and then north towards Spokane, finally to Coeur d'Alene, or to Cataldo where the treaty was signed, and then back. Now I've done most of the route from north of the Snake, which is about here, to Cataldo and back. And I'm working on this part in this section in here. And I know very little of the route around the Dalles. It's incredibly confusing for me because it's 10 mile, 8 mile, 5 mile. I have the Kalecki maps, and they're clear when I'm an armchair topographer. But when I try to take the Kalecki maps and put them on a modern map, I'm at a loss, so I'm going to need some help. And so I'm not going to be talking much about the route from the first 15 or 20 miles of the Wright campaign route. So we'll start off then with our Steptoe campaign that started at Fort Walla Walla. I put new batteries in. Now our main actors for the, am I including you? The main actors are of course Colonel Steptoe and Governor Stevens, who was 2 years behind Steptoe at West Point. Steptoe graduated about in the middle of his class. Stevens graduated number 1 in his class. And not only number 1, he was number 1 in every course he took. And in the Steptoe campaign, the 2 officers that were killed in it were Gaston, who was suffering from throat cancer, and he hoped to die in battle, and he got his wish. The other was Captain Taylor. He, of course, didn't want to die in battle. His wife had just joined him at Fort Walla Walla, a squad of tragedy, with his 2 little daughters when he marched to the Steptoe. Now, to set the... I didn't push anything. Now, since the stories that I'm talking to you about are really based on appreciation of the Kalecki field note maps and the collected field notes on the bearings and the location sites, I thought it important to show you the beauty of his map straight away. And to do that, I picked the junction of the Walla Walla River, it was right here, with the Columbia, at the great bend of the Columbia River. And you can look at, just get an idea of the enormous detail that he showed. And he was always concerned about paper, so he put as much on one page as possible. This part of the map right here, this lower part below the dot line, you have to hook the Walla Walla River from here up to there to hook it together. But the amount of detail is incredibly surprising. Here's a little sketch he made of Chimney Rock, and it's right here. This is a sketch of Ross Point and McKenzie Point. And here's Ross Point and McKenzie Point here. This is what it would look like. So Kalecki not only just drew these beautiful maps, that you can see here, great detail, and he must have been on horseback most of the time, but he drew these little sketches of important topographical features that he saw in the countryside. And looking at the arrow, I'll get fairly close. Here we go. It's the old Fort Walla Walla, and here's the two chimney peaks, and he showed this little V between Ross Point, and one of these must be McKenzie, I don't know which. But anyway, this was done, this is a Stanley Dell, a lot of you are aware, I'm sure, of the radio reports, looking south past the old Fort Walla Walla. And I found these very interesting, these old lithographs are very interesting to kind of figure out what the countryside looked like in a lot of the forts. Now, to put the campaign that took place here in Oregon Territory in perspective of the United States today, we have St. Louis here, so everything, the topography and the map, the land was all well understood in this part of the United States, and also around Puget Sound, up the Columbia River to Fort Walla Walla. And everybody knew about Fort Benton, that's as far up as Missouri River you could go. But to get from Fort Benton to Walla Walla was difficult. You had to cross both the Bitterroot Range and the Rocky Mountains. And so Congress instructed the Army to put in a wagon road between these two forts, Walla Walla on the Columbia and Fort Benton on the Missouri. And that task was assigned to Lieutenant Mullen. And this shows, this is a Sohn lithograph of Fort Benton, which is right here. They reconstructed that. And the reason we had Fort Benton, that's as far up the Missouri River as you could go. The other thing to consider in the 1880s is what was white and what belonged to the Indian. And you see in the early 1850s, half of what we now have as modern United States was Native American. But it changed very quickly in 15 years to this distribution of Indian-owned land, the sovereign land, and that land belonging to the United States. This range is limited. Okay. Now, it wasn't just so simple to put a wagon road in because people were already living here. There were a lot of Indians in the area between Fort Benton and Fort Walla Walla. There were the Pondereys, the Coeur d'Alenes, Blueses, Nez Perce, who had a huge area in here, the Flatheads around Fort Benton, Walla Wallas, and there were plenty of roads from here to there. You could go anywhere you wanted in the Northwest on an Indian road. In fact, Mullen many times referred to the Indian trails as actual roads. They've been used for so many years that the trails have been turned into roads. And that's why it was so easy for the early pioneers to adapt the Indian roads to wagon roads. Anyway, there were a number of possible routes to get from Walla Walla to Fort Benning. One was this green one here, which is the Lolo Trail, used by Lewis and Clark, and that's a hellaciously difficult trail. And Governor Stevens knew right away that that trail would be out. And he was well aware in '53, he knew that the best way to get from Walla Walla to Benton would be to use the Coeur d'Alene Trail, as indicated here, from Fort Walla Walla region up to the region around Spokane, and then you come across the Panhandle, Idaho, and finally come to Fort Benning. And so this route was the put in the wagon route was given to Mullen, and he was assembling a road crew at the time that Steptoe was building the last Fort Walla Walla in the area that became Walla Walla. And of course, there wasn't a lot of regard to the fact that there were already Indians in the area. And the most important Indians to confront this road building scheme was the Coeur d'Alenes. And the Coeur d'Alenes had already, for the most part, 3/4 have already been converted to Catholicism. And I show Louise Surine because she was the aunt of Chief Vincent, who was one of the major players in the Steptoe battle. So this is the Fort Walla Walla of 1858 that Steptoe had constructed. And Steptoe was certainly a very competent officer, and I'll come back to that. So he had the ability to build structures, build buildings that you need for a fort, and to put the fort in the proper location. We have what's called Steptoe Butte in the middle of the Palouse. I don't know how many of you folks have been up to the Palouse, but right smack dab in the middle is a peak that protrudes above the fields of lava, or the rolling Palouse Hills. And you can see this peak from any high peak from 40 miles around. It's like a lighthouse, a beacon that you can navigate through the Palouse. And we'll come back to that. It was played prominent during the Wright campaign. Whenever they were on the top of a large hill, they knew where they were. So we're talking about the Steptoe campaign. Steptoe encountered absolutely no problems from Fort Walla Walla to Moscow, Idaho. Then he crossed the Palouse River, about where the city of Palouse is, went on up along the Washington-Idaho border to Farmington, then crossed over to Rosalia. That was called at the time in Gossamer Creek, or Toholaniming by the Nez Perce. Now this map is a Kalecki map made 4 months after the Steptoe campaign. And why I show it is that it completely changes how we envision what had happened during the Steptoe campaign. Steptoe, with his 156 dragoons, had marched with no trouble from Walla Walla, so up, here's Walla Walla, along the Idaho border, over here to modern-day Rosalia, with no encounters with Indians. On the day of 16 May, he was stopped dead in his tracks about here. Now this map was made by Kalecki 4 months later, and he made it during the march back from Coeur d'Alene Lake to the Snake River. And this one little map right here shows the trail the Wright was on. And this little patch of water was dry at the time. It's now Stubblefield Lake. It was indicated on the Kalecki map, and Mullen stated that they marched by the remnants of the Indian lodges who were involved in the Steptoe campaign. They were right here at Stubbleville. And Colecki shows a group of teepees right here. And this is the village of Selah. And Steptoe was stopped right about here on a trail leading north by Chief Vincent and a few other chiefs. And Steptoe was surprised he was stopped because he had done nothing to provoke the Indians. On the other hand, the Indians felt they were being provoked because Steptoe kept changing trails. He'd been on a couple major trails heading north. Finally, he was on a really tiny little trail going northwest from Roselia, and it says trail at Colonel Steptoe, to Colonel Steptoe's battleground. Steptoe was on this little trail that dead-ended in the encampment of Selah here. Didn't go through it, dead-ended there. Well, of course the Indians thought they were under attack. Also, Steptoe had 2 mountain howitzers. And where they stopped Steptoe, the Indians right here, and there were about 1,000 Indians, and Steptoe said, well, where'd all these Indians come from? That's kind of a quote. Well, they didn't have far to come. There were 34 lodges right here. And the Indians had been tracking him all the way from the Snake River. Well, Steptoe never made any mention that he was close to this village of Selah. He never saw it. I've been on this trail, and when you're a half a mile away from the village, you don't see a thing. You're still in the Blues Hills. And the village itself was the spring camas grounds where the Indians were digging camas. And that's why they were there. They'd been there for about a week. The camas fields around the historically important camas grounds of the Coeur d'Alenes near their village, Coeur d'Alene, were still under snow at that time. And so every spring they would leave early, take the 60-mile trek to the west to dig early camas here. Steptoe didn't know it, he would stop here. That was the first farm. And this is a picture of the area where the Indians, the blue haze is that at Camas. Here's some closer up here. And just to show you what Camas looked like, blue flower, kind of an onion about an inch across. And I dug this square foot of turf near our farm just to show the density. And there's about a dozen bulbs per square foot, and if you convert that to acre, it's quite a large number. And if you convert that to pounds, there's a lot of camas per acre. And that's why the Indians were very zealous of their camas grounds. This provided the starch that they needed. Okay. Now, 4 months later, Colecki visited the Steptoe battleground. So this is not made during the Steptoe campaign. This figure is the one that's published, actually, in the 35th Congressional Records. Rests on 2 maps made by Colecki when he was sent with Mullen and a few other troops to pick up the remains of the fallen soldiers and the 2 cannons at the Steptoe battleground. And so I'll show these in just a minute. But the right half of the map will exactly correspond to the original field notes. And there's nothing that corresponds to the left hand of the map, which is interesting. This part of the map, this quadrant, is incorrect completely. And I found a few errors in collecting maps. But he's got Pine Creek in the wrong place. It should be down here. He's got it coming up here. Here's Selah up here, the Indian encampment. And Roselia's here. The Steptoe would come on this trail, and he was stopped right about here. this part of the map is accurate. I guess that Dr. Randolph told Kalecki about this little rock cliff right here and explained that there was a sheet of water here that the troops had splashed across. They were stopped here. The chief told him to go back. They argued a bit, but not long, because they were soon surrounded by 1,000 Indians. So that they thought they'd better retreat. So they retreated 2 miles and came to this little cliff. Steptoe had agreed to retreat. Vincent thought, okay, he's going to go back to Moscow or Farmington. But he didn't. He only went back 1.5 miles. And he camped here, and there's only 3 miles to Selah. Well, that didn't make the chief very comfortable, of course. And he picked an area that's quite defensible. And I'll show why. If you blow up this area right here, okay, here's the campground from the night of May 16th. And this is the camp right here. He was stopped here by the Indians on this trail, which dead-ended up a Selah here. They didn't go all the way back down here to Farmington. They went 1.5 miles or 2 miles along this cliff. So they had a defensible cliff to their rear, to the west, and there was a sheet of water in front of them. And I'll show another mag of that. Here we go. Okay, so this is even a higher gain, and now you can see the clear contour lines of this cliff. And Kalecki noted on this map that the contour lines are 50 feet intervals in elevation. The sheet of water that Greg talked about would have been here, that the troops splashed across to get to this redoubt, where they stayed for 3 hours mounted on a little loose hill while Steptoe talked with the chief. And nobody knows what he had to say. I asked my Indian friends, what do you think he said? And they said, we don't know for 3 hours. How many ways can we tell you, go back? So here's the cliff, and it's the only cliff within a radius of about 4 or 5 miles. And this is a little loose hill that Steptoe had escaped back to, and the troops remained mounted on this hill for 3 hours. Now, the next view is from the other side. And here I have a mask of Father Connolly, so I have a priest, I have a historian, I have 2 Indians. The sheet of water was about here. The troops had remained on this little hill for the 3 hours while these men talked. That's Steptoe and Vincent talked for 3 hours, and we're not sure what was said. And my 2 Indian friends kept saying, I don't know how many times we can tell you, go home. So we had a lot of fun discussing what was said for 3 hours, standing at this site of the second parlay. What I think happened was, well, at this time, Steptoe and Chief Vincent were parlaying together. Now, during the first parlay, Steptoe used his Nez Perce guides, his interpreters, and he realized right away, I can't trust these Nez Perce guides because they led me into a trap. The Coeur d'Alenes did not like the Nez Perce Indians. They'd been at war for several hundred years, and they still don't like it for that matter. That's why they have a much better casino. And they love telling people that too. Now, for this second parlay, Steptoe and Chief Vincent were there for 3 hours. Now, Steptoe knew Parisian French from high school. And I think probably Vincent, I'm not sure. Now, this is conjecture, I'm telling you, but it's as an amateur, I'm allowed to do this, right? This is the fun part. I think Vincent knew Voyageurs French because the Coeur d'Alenes traded a lot at Fort Colville. And the Hudson's Bay Company used Iroquois Indians for most of their forts and most of the trade with Indians. And I know that lots of Coeur d'Alene Indians indeed knew Voyageurs French. So the two may have tried to converse in French, and it would have been difficult, and it would have taken a long time. Now we're going to go back. These are the original. These are the original. One of the original field notes made by Pilecki in that little book, the field note maps. And they were camped on the return route after Wright had already put the Indians, came down this little trail towards Rosalia. And he made a little figure here of a basalt mesa, a little knob. And that knob you can still see from Highway 195. It's a wonderful basalt knob, and it allows me to identify this hill here, this canyon, and the trail that went up to Sealand, right up here. I had to sketch this in. This part was drawn by Pilecki, but I don't think he went up there. And this is where the second parlay took place. The morning of the 17th, Steptoe was up early. They were gone by 3 or 4 in the morning, marching back towards, marching south, indeed, on the return route towards the Snake River. In the meantime, that night, Father Josette had ridden 60 miles from Mission on Coeur d'Alene River, as we now call it Cataldo, all the way to Seal, to argue with Chief Vincent that, well, why don't we ride down and parlay again? But when they got to the camp, Steptoe was gone. They rode very hard and they caught up to him about in here. And Steptoe wouldn't stop to parlay. Of course he wouldn't stop because he thought he would be subjecting his troops to an ambush. So he agreed to a marching parlay, and they agreed not to fight. You got to remember, most of the Coeur d'Alenes, of which Vincent was one, were Catholic, and they were zealous about being Catholic. That's why they really didn't want to fight. And Father Josette actually brokered this agreement. Let's don't fight until about here, and then they shook hands. However, after the Coeur d'Alenes agreed not to fight, they rode up onto this hill to watch the troops' progress as they turned into this canyon. This is the North Fork of Pine Creek. The Palouse Indians rode over to this bluff right here and opened up fire. So the battle started here, not because of the Coeur d'Alenes, but because of the Palouse Indians. And this is a painting by Nona Hennon. She's got this exactly in the right spot. She went there and looked. She didn't know it at the time. She just thought that would be a nice spot to make this handshake. And she, by chance, happened to get it exactly right. There's a little bluff here. They're in one of the little valleys running into North Pine Creek. This is Father Josette. This is a Nez Perce guide. Right after they shook hands, the Nez Perce guide whacked Vincent with his riding crop and called him a coward. I don't know what Steptoe did, but he acted immediately and refused the situation. And Victor, a sub-chief, said, well, let's each go home. It's all taken care of now. We can return back. So the quick thinking Steptoe averted a battle, the beginning of the battle right there with Coeur d'Alenes. Now this is the other half of the next section of map sketched by Pilecki of the battlefield. And here's this little basalt mesa again right here, which allows one to stitch the two maps together. And this is the course of Pine Creek. Hasn't changed a bit. Rosalia is sitting right in here. And if you go to Rosalia, there's a monument where Steptoe had his redoubt of the 17th of May. And that's exactly in the right spot where the monument is. So what had happened, Steptoe was marching back along about to here. And when he got pretty close to this mesa right here, the Palouse Indians started firing on them. And the cavalry held fire for quite a while. But then they decided about in here, they had better take this high ground. So they took this first hill right here, this collected sketch. And the Palouse Indians continued a very rapid fire on the soldiers. And the soldiers only had musketoons. They also had horse pistols. The musketoons were not good at long range. The Indians actually had a better rifle. The Hudson's Bay rifle had more range than the musketoon. They reached this, there's an airstrip now right here. They reached this first hill, and Lieutenant Gregg took the second hill. And when Lieutenant Gregg was on the second hill, the Coeur d'Alene's were watching what was going on. And Malcapsy, who was a hothead, said to his friends, now's the time to cut the head of the snake off. Let's charge down this ravine and get the next company breaking over the hill right here. Well, his friend says, we don't want to do that. Well, Vincent said, I just shook hands. We can't do this. So Malcapsy whacked his friends with a whip. This must be the way they got each other's attention, and called them cowards. And he said, well, you stay here. I go down and fight. So Malcapsy rode down into this canyon, started alone, and of course all his buddies said, well, you can't go alone, we'll join. So Victor, Jean-Pierre, and Zachary, and 12 other Coeur d'Alene Indians joined Malcapsy, and they got right down here in this little ravine. Gregg saw what was going on. He bugled back to the main company, asking for a right angle scissor movement, and we'll catch the Indians in this ravine in a right angle charge. So Gaston charged down the hill. Gregg rode hard up the canyon and then charged at a right angle down the canyon. And they caught the Indian ponies in a right angle scissor movement. And they killed 12, just like that. I always wondered, how in the world is a cavalry going to catch the Indian pony? Never made any sense. But when you go there, you see why. The Indians were in this tight little ravine. They were pushed against the assault wall, and at very close, pinpoint range, the musketoons were very, very effective. And that's why they were able to kill 12. The Indians had panicked, fired too soon, and there were no, at that point, there were no Army fatalities. Well, anyway, as it turns out, Victor, who wanted peace, was killed. Jean-Pierre, who wanted peace, was killed. And Zachary was killed. And Malcapsy got back. And he crops up again during the right, and come back again. Anyway, the cavalry continued their retreat, and Taylor was shot from the source right about here along the Pine Creek. Then Lieutenant Gaston was shot from his horse. His company panicked and left him to die on the field. They continued their retreat to the modern day area right here. And this is a, can you see this all right? Can we turn out these lights? Maybe it would help. Does that help at all?
Yes.
This is fairly faint, but I did take it from the original in the Library of Congress. And you can see the Palouse Indians sketched here in the forefront. There's a little hill right here. This is the redoubt that Steptoe was occupying. And this is Pine Creek coming like this. The Spokane Indians are here. And on the original, you can see in the distance on the horizon the Coeur d'Alene Indians. On May 15th, Steptoe had camped here on his way up the Seal to the Indian village, so he knew where he was here. And there were really very few casualties inflicted during this redoubt period here. They were surrounded, they were down to very little ammunition, but Indians didn't know that. That night, they decided to retreat because the next day, surely they would be defeated and they would all be slaughtered. And so Steptoe and his men decided to retreat back. The Army account, well, secondary, tertiary accounts said they retreated under darkness. So I went back and I got the records, naval records of where the moon was at that day, that fateful day, and it was still almost a half moon. So it wasn't dark by any stretch of the imagination. And there's no indication that there was cloud cover. In fact, the whole Steptoe and his men a number of times on the march up had reported or written that the weather was extremely nice. So anyway, around 9 o'clock they decided to retreat. Now, the Army version, not Steptoe's version, but Steptoe just said they simply retreated. Secondary accounts said they snuck out under darkness. The Coeur d'Alene version is that we parted our lines and let them go. And that's probably more likely what did happen. The Palouse Indians were occupying along here. Maybe they all retreated back to this area to the east. In any event, Steptoe was able to escape and ride back to that is about as spooky and electronic glitch as I have seen, where we're just moving this through air causes that thing to change. I don't get that. But anyway, that's the Steptoe campaign. There were seven killed, and the outcome was horrendous because this was a major defeat. And this made big news back with Congress. And they directed the Army to immediately mount a large force and retaliate and teach the Indians a lesson. It was a punitive expedition, as it were, that Colonel George Wright was asked to head up. I think I heard a question.
Now, how many troops did Steptoe have with him?
158.
And he left the howitzers when he broke and ran.
Pardon me?
And he left his howitzers,
Yeah.
his cannon when he...
Yeah, and all of his supplies too. I went over that a little quickly.
Okay.
And he left his supplies, and the Coeur d'Alene Indians got everything, and they didn't share with the other Indians. But they were happy to get the booty. And I think that probably says something what may have happened on the second and third parleys. That Vincent may have said, if you leave your stuff, we let you go home. And so when they left their stuff, the Coeur d'Alene Indians were happy enough. They had the booty, the warriors were pleased. They took the mules and the harnesses up to Fort Colville and sold everything to the Hudson's Bay Company. That did not set right, of course, with the U.S. Army. That's another story.
What were the numbers of both the Palouse and the Coeur d'Alene?
All total, maybe about 1,000 Indians. But the main Indians that were doing most of the fighting were the Palouse. The Coeur d'Alenes did have the one charge that I talked about. But probably casualties were about the same on both sides. Yes?
Where did you get the Coeur d'Alene version?
Pardon me?
Where did you get the Coeur d'Alene version of the story?
From the Cy Johns. Cliff Cy John was an elder at one time, and his brothers, Merle and Frankie, are descendants of Victor. And getting off is kind of a neat story now that you ask. That's the trouble. We're doing two campaigns, and each one would be a lecture. But this is a good question for me to follow up on. We took Frankie and Merle on an excursion that we put. This is the Whitman County Historical Society, and I think it was a whole busload of folks that went on it, and these two Indians. And we took them right to where their great-great-great-grandfather had fallen during the Steptoe War. And it was quite an emotional outing because of that. They gave a couple prayers for the fallen Indian warrior because that's important to do, even if it's 150 years late. And so they were very happy to have been on that actual site. And again, the actual spot was identified from that Plucky map. You know exactly within 50 feet where it happened. So, any other questions on, yeah?
I admired one of your earlier maps showed all these contours. That particular one, unless they're up on a high ridge, did you compare those contours to an actual contour?
They are perfect. And I hope you come up and look at some of his original maps. The question had to do with the contour maps and collecting. They are incredibly accurate.
I mean, compared to an actual contour map?
Compared to a modern topographical map, I cannot imagine how he did it. Many times they did 20 miles of march a day. That would be 3 of these maps, and they would be, for the most part, on. Except there was part of the battlefield map of Steptoe, that left-hand part, he wasn't there. I'm sure of that. But apparently the Surgeon Randolph and a couple other officers told him about this cliff that Steptoe had managed to get his troops back onto after that first parliament for a protective.
I think the photogrammetry, what we use to do that, I think that, how they do.
I don't know. I hope we can talk more about that if you know about it, because it boggles my mind. Okay, so here we are. Any other questions about Steptoe? By the way, we can go back to questions afterwards. I have all afternoon free. So here's the Dows in 58, and I don't know who did this. This should be familiar to somebody. And anyway, if any of you have a question of one of these images or would like to have it, just leave it. Leave me your email and I can email it to you. It's all digitalized. It's one neat thing about it. Anyway, here's the Dallas. 58, this would be the world of right. Now, these are the camps that he had to get from the Dalles. He didn't camp at Biggs, but he went through Biggs. Then he camped at Muddy Springs, and Moni and I just found that yesterday. And that was really exciting to find Muddy Springs. We were looking for it last summer and couldn't find it. And then he camped at John Days River, Rock Creek, Willow Creek, Butternut Creek. This was a long trip from Willow Creek to Butter Creek. It's 30 miles through desert. And I don't know how good the water was at Well Springs, but it was probably mainly alkaline because the whole flat's alkaline. And once they made it to Butter Creek, then they hit the Umatilla River, marched up the Umatilla to the second Umatilla campsite, which is right in Pendleton today, and then went north to Walla Walla. And while the troops were both at the Dalles, and actually started back at Fort Vancouver, they were practicing they were practicing maneuvers and doing a lot of target practice. They had new rifles, and they continued that at Fort Walla Walla, right here. So we have to now put Wright in the proper perspective. Wright had been through the Mexican War. He knew what that was. In the American-Mexican War, he was decorated, and he was in a couple battles against 14,000 Mexicans. And during those battles, the U.S. suffered 1,500 casualties. So he knew what war was. And the Mexicans were no pushover. The Mexicans were extremely well trained in European tradition during the American-Mexican War. It was not the Mexican troops that were at fault, it was their officers weren't particularly good. And Santana was not good at all. So anyway, that's another story. We have to push on. Because again, as I said earlier, Wright did 760 miles round trip. And what was that distance again from the Dalles to so it's 120 here and another 40. is about 160 up here to Fort Walla Walla. So there's a lot of space to cover. He's at Fort Walla Walla. He's got to get clear up here to the mission on the Coeur d'Alene River. Lake Coeur d'Alene's a pretty small dock right there. That's a lot of territory.
You show a St. Joe River, is that the Park Fork now?
No. The
That's
St. Joe River flows into what's now, the whole thing is called Lake Coeur d'Alene. We'll come back to that.
Okay.
At the time of the Wright
Excuse me, I'm
campaign.
on the wrong leg.
Well, that's okay.
Okay.
Yes. I'm just as confused here. Now, I put this in just to show, this is one of his notes, a page from the note, to give an idea of this beautiful script. And this is, what's that from? This is on June 5th from camp to Deschutes. And the reason he crossed it out, that formally the Army wanted the routes to be noted from Biggs, essentially, on. And so his first, and I have those, it's lucky I took them because he crossed them out. I didn't realize how important they were. So I have those images too. But it just shows how beautifully he wrote. And on each map, you have a location. These are the locations on a given map to go with this page. This is the odometer reading. This is the arrival time, departure time, and this is the grade that they marched up. And these are notes about the either the reading to the south or the north or the bearing. Now this is his sketch of the chutes, and yesterday I crawled up to about here on some private property and got a picture of this island with, I don't know if I'm going to be able to identify these, but I'll try to do that when I get back. This is the Columbia River, and when you read it in the back, this is a view, a sketch of the mouth of the Deschutes River right here. Now, this is the first, it's not the first map. These maps are so fuzzy and the light's so bad at the National Archives, I could never tell if I was in focus or not. So lo and behold, the map in front of this one, the most important one of the series, was fuzzy. So I got to go back and get that. So the trail is coming along the Columbia River to get up to modern day Biggs, right here. It essentially followed, I guess that's Highway 30 today. And then it came up on, I think this is the Oregon Trail coming along on the ridge. And then this is, which highway here? Muddy Hollow Road is somewhere in here. And anyway, we found Muddy Springs that the Wright campaign camped on yesterday. It's right on this map right here. I can show you on a modern map. The Wright campaign okay, I forgot to put this in. This gives us, this is the same view of the Columbia River. Here's the island. And this is a trail that Wright was on. I think that's the Oregon Trail. This is Highway 97, and Mud Hollow Road comes off of it, and Muddy Springs Camp is right there. And we looked all along here from this road, and the only water we found was right in here. And it's a sizable spring, and it is muddy. So that must be the right one. On the way to John Day's River, this is what we saw today. Well, last summer. I mean, it's changed a lot since Wright was there. And this just again shows the beautiful contours that you were talking about. And this is the dividing ridge coming down into the John Days River. And here's the camp right here. And this canyon is just exactly like that. And this dividing ridge is where our cars parked right here. So they marched, I don't know which side they marched down on, but anyway, this is part of the trail that I just showed you on the collecting. It's amazing. Of course, my wife doesn't think it's so amazing because she doesn't quite have the passion I have. Some fellows there. And this is the mouth of John Days River. I put an apostrophe in there. I think that's a mistake today, right? But I'm trying to use the spelling that Pulaski used. So, I'm moving too fast. All right, look at this beautiful map here. Here is the camp on John Days River, right here. They crossed the river right there, marched in the valley to about here, and then followed the mouth of Rock Creek up to where Rock Creek Canyon splits. And this is Cedar Grove or Cedar Spring camp on the Oregon Trails up in here. They camped down here, and I able to identify all these little curves and where he crossed over. It's unbelievably accurate. I don't know how he did it. This is about 10 miles across here. Anyway, he did. I don't know if he got off his horse to do this or he could do it while he was on the horse.
You know, I was just thinking about, they were moving 10 miles a day if you had your 160 miles right to 10. So if you ride 10 miles a day, how do you have time to put in those incredible contours?
I don't know.
It's just amazing.
I think this might be one of the most spectacular field notes. Well, I'm an amateur at it, but I've looked at maybe 30 or 40 field notes at the National Archives, and I've got images of a lot of them, and nothing matches these. So here we are. This is at the intersection where they were camped. You can go right to that spot. Now, Wright had 700 men, 760 men, and 200 packers, 400 mules. I don't know why he needed 200 packers or mule skinners for 400 mules, but he did. 800 horses. So it was a huge complement of men and horses. They needed about 40 acres of grassland for that number of mules and horses. So they were spread out over a pretty good site. And maybe that's why they didn't always follow the Oregon Trail, because they needed good pasture on the way to the Umatilla. Now this is the route. Again, it's just a beautiful little sketch of the contours coming into Willow Creek. And the road comes right along there today. And they camp right about here on Willow Creek.
Was that Shuttler Flat, should they come up with that rock creek, is that the same as Shuttler Flat?
On that earlier slide, I don't know.
No, Shuttler Flat is east about 6 or 8 miles from
Rock Creek?
from that building there and all those signs.
I don't know the
Shut-
local. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer that.
Is it always on Rock Creek?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I understand now.
We can always go back to one of those if you want from the originals. I'll be happy to show you those. So here is the Willow Creek campsite. It would have been right along in this alfalfa field today. Oh, that's wrong. That's also Willow Creek. And I just made a mistake. Moni and I visited Butter Creek, and it's dry as a bone. And just, I don't know what the early immigrants did for water, but we didn't find any. And this is a mistake. That's just another shot of the gold. Now I show this one. This is, again, a beautiful map. Here's the Walla Walla River. And this is sketched in Pembroke. And I just met Pam Broom, this Pam Broom's great-great-grandson. And we found this spot of land a couple days ago, and he's standing there on his great-great-granddad's patch of land that the Wright campaign marched by 150 years ago. I mean, that's pretty spectacular. We know where we were because, again, this beautiful contour of this hill, this shows a side view, and the scalloping is about 50 to 60 feet above the plains. And these are all nice house sites today. Good views off of it. But anyway, this is the way Wright marched up to get to Walla Walla. And this is the Whitman site right here. So they crossed the Walla Walla River right where Whitman had taken his mill race off from the Walla Walla. That's how precise those maps are. Now, they stayed at Fort Walla Walla for a few days, continued to train. He knew what he was doing. Wright certainly knew what he was doing to get prepared to the Indians. He had a lot of anxiety because, as you can see, he's here at Fort Walla Walla, and the Indians are somewhere up in this enormous area. And of course, if you're looking at a map back in Washington, you're looking at a map, and this enormous area is now the size of your fingernail. And of course, then the armchair army people had no appreciation for what Wright was getting into. And Wright had maps of this area. He knew how large it was, and how in the world was he to find the Indians. He did not really expect to get.
What was his mission then? Was his mission to find this road, or was his mission to find those Indians and
Wright's mission was to punish the Indians involved in the Steptoe campaign and to clear the way for the road to Fort Benning. And he knew that the Coeur d'Alenes were the important Indians to be involved because the Coeur d'Alenes were the gatekeepers of where we now find Highway 90. That's the way you get to Fort Benton, is on Highway 90. That's why Highway 90 is where it's at and not going on the Lolo Trail. Because it was a good trail from Spokane to Fort Benton. But Steptoe's purpose was simply to march through the land as a show of force. And that did not succeed. He was whipped. But he had the good sense to realize he was whipped and to get back. I mean, I think it was a heroic effort of his and a great decision to go back. He didn't want to. But anyway, that was the reason for the Wright campaign, was to punish the Indians involved in the Steptoe campaign, make sure that he could have a peace so that the road could go through. Otherwise, the road would not go through. And to cross the Snake River, when Steptoe did in May, was perilous. It's a raging current, even where Steptoe crossed at Red Wolf Crossing. Maybe that's why he went far to the east instead of crossing straight north of Fort Walla Walla like Wright did. Wright crossed a few miles up from the mouth of the Palouse. This is a Toucan here. He marched from Fort Walla Walla to the Toucan, down the Toucan, and then came across the Snake River here in boats for the troops, and the Indians swam horses across. He had 30 Nez Perce Indians who were guides, and there were no fatalities, no incident whatsoever in crossing this river. And as a kid, I swum the Palouse a few times. I mean the Palouse too, but I mean the Snake River above Lewiston, and it's an amazing current. I wouldn't do it today, but so even though I'm trying to redo this, I'm not going to try to swim that. Well, it's all slack water anyway, probably. Anyway, he got the troops across, no problem. Before he did manage to get them all across, they had an enormous rainstorm, and they had to stay here on the other side of the Toucan for a couple of days and dry out, which was amazing because they were in a drought like the Northwest had ever seen. It was the middle of a 10-year drought, The grass was tinder dry. The Indians knew that. The Indians were going to let them come into the Palouse and then set fires to them and hopefully get them trapped. So the Indians had a plan too. And of course the Indians were watching their progress every step of the way. He got across with no trouble. So here he is. He's right here ready to cross the Palouse River, the Snake River right here, a little bit to the east of the Palouse River. This is looking back. Here's looking up the Toucan, right across, right here, and you can see how accurate Mona Hingen's painting is. Right camped right on this bench right about here, overlooking the Snake River. And here, oh darn, here is another of these wonderful collecting maps, but he had a couple days to do this one. Here's the course of the Snake River, going here down, the mouth of the Palouse River. This is the Toucan River coming in to the Snake River, and the dotted line is his trail. And I have to admit, I didn't walk this. It's 1,800 feet from the Snake River up to the plateau. I used my four-wheeler. So I cheated a bit. The troops didn't get to cheat. The next campsite was 18 miles north at this point. You can see they made a jog right here coming out. They continued north. And I've identified every bit of this trail within 50 yards. And I'll show you these 2 points here in just a moment. Coming down this little ravine and going up the other side to get to the Palouse River at present-day Hooper. When they were up about halfway up the canyon, they could look over the canyon wall. Well, anyway, the troops that were on left flank could look over into the Palouse River Canyon, into this view. They did not march by Palouse Falls. They were in to the east, about 4 or 5 miles. But isn't that a spectacular canyon? We're just a couple miles upriver from the mouth of the Palouse River. And this is the trace. It's still there, coming down the one ravine that I talked about. It's kind of, there's a lot of ash in it and sand, and that's why it's easy to find. And this is going up the other side of the ravine, and you can see that, well, maybe I have too much imagination, but anyway, the ground has a different texture right where this red line is. And I believe that was, of course, to get up, and then they went around this hill. This is a modern Jeep road today, but this is the trace that Mike was on. Does it look, did I convince you? You don't have to be. So they went by, that was a pretty quick trip. They went by Palouse Falls. This one was by Gustav Sohn, who was a sketch artist, also a German. Was right everyone. He had not only Mullen, who was the official engineer, photographer on this campaign, wrote extensive notes, which you can hardly read, and I have all the originals. But he had the luck to have Sohn and collect. This was done earlier by Sohn. So they knew a lot of the topography in the area. Now the next campsite was Camp Aspen, and this is a little section of the camp. And here's Camp Aspen with the date, and here's a little lake right here, and he wrote lake in it. And on my original Xeroxes, I couldn't even read that. And that only comes clear when you do the manipulations of the original. You get rid of the brown background, the paper is turned brown, and to sharpen the pencil marks by a sharpening program that does that. But it just shows his beautiful printing. And by the way, he took bearings of the North Star regularly. Polaris. And I haven't even learned to do that yet. That's another task I have to do. And this is a small lake. They call it Camp Aspen, and that's a small lake that's still there today. And here's some of the aspen growth. It's just amazing when you can go to that actual site and follow the route as he progressed north. So he's right about, here's the Snake River, here's Palouse. He marched north of Palouse, and he's in one of these camps about here at Camp Aspen. Still about 40 miles from Spokane. Now, this is another figure that I find just amazing. Can you see that in the back okay? It's amazing because here's a little columnar basalt sketch right here. And I'm just showing a few of these. Every map has every topographical feature that's important sketched on it. They call this the Giant's Causeway, and that sketch is put on. Now, a number of you will recognize this. This is the formal map. I invite you to come up and look at it later. This is the formal map made by Mullen that went to Congress. This is published in the 35th Congressional Record. This map has been made from these Kalecki maps that I have here. But how do I know that? Well, I know it because each map between the first bearing location and the last bearing location on every map, back in Washington, they drew a line and they used that overall bearing to construct that bearing off of the 150 individual field note bearings. And so this is a fairly accurate map, but it only gets you within 6 miles. So this is the only map I have at first, and I couldn't really find where right had been on most of these campsites. So this is amazing. Here's this columnar of basalt right here. This is called Crooked Knee Lake now, this little lake right here. And the trail marches through here. And my wife had the good nature to follow me on this trail. It's about 7 miles from here to here. And there's a lake covered with bulrushes right here. And I could never find that lake because it's not there anymore. Somebody drained it 100 years ago. And that was never indicated on the modern topography map. Now this is a blow-up of that middle part. You can see the basalt cliff of hexagonal columns. And this yellow line is the start of the mesa that comes around like this. It's about 1.5 miles in diameter. And here's the other side of the mesa, of the second mesa. And the troops march through a little valley between these two mesas. This is looking from the top of the eastern mesa right here that swings around, and here's the edge of it. This is the other mesa to the west. The troops march up this valley. And this is probably the mesa that Plecky sketched. And I used to like to say, well, you can't climb those. So I made the mistake of having my nephew come with me. And of course, there he is, showing the need to get up there. It caused a lot of anxiety. Which wasn't so bad, but the next thing, there's my granddaughter up there. And this gives an idea of the extent of just one of these walls. And on top of each one of these mesas are these hexagonal blocks. So you're walking on, there's a lot of dirt on it, but you're walking on top of these mesas that are surrounded, and Wright was marching between them. And of course, the Indians were certainly on top watching it too. And here's my wife Moni to show that she had good nature to go with me. This little pond right here was on the Kalecki map, exactly at that spot. On the Kalecki map, it's about a 32nd of an inch in diameter. So that shows how sharp this pencil was, because it wasn't just a dot, it was a circle. Now, the next spot to reach was Camp Pedregal. Here it is. And I think I may have skipped something. Let's see. No, I didn't. Never mind. And I show this because this is the first charge of the Indians. And this little ridge here I was able to identify. And can you see these red notations right here? Is that, you don't have to read them, just see that there's some red notations. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. All right. This line, this location point is connected by this line to the first location point down here. And that bearing was used to construct that part of the map, of the formal map that Congress got. I didn't see any of that my first trip back to Washington, D.C. That only really became apparent when I did the color correction part on the computer program. I found that amazing. So, they broke camp at Camp Pedregal, and they called that Camp Pedregal because this part of the train must have reminded him of the Pedregal formations just outside of Mexico City. And to take Mexico City, but of course they already did, they took Mexico City. And so I think that's probably